Perhaps I sound like an alarmist. Perhaps it's because I am. But in the last decade, English grammar has been reduced to not much more than the remnants of a system characterized only by oppression and power, as well as something that is altogether useless and dismissible with regards to effectively teaching composition and writing, at least in the mainstream academic world at the post secondary level. These sort of claims have been made outright in many cases, strewn amongst audiences far and wide as incontrovertible fact, despite being very much an opinion, an ill-informed one at that, often accompanied with little to no empirical merit, while pundits still doggedly attribute identitarian ideologies to being apropos of student self-worth. And therefore, because English grammar allegedly and only carries with it the mystical and hierarchical notions of prescriptivism and correctness, it is a dangerous, yes, these very words have been said in my face, a dangerous kind of system that only serves to uphold power generally attributed to Caucasians of European descent. Every language has a set of rules, or a grammar, which help us as humans organize thoughts into patterns that allow us to effectively communicate ideas with others. But the purpose of composition studies in the current climate is shifting very rapidly, and it seems to be tied to the use of writing as a means for effecting change that is only associated with achieving some semblance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever is deemed to be the ultimate goal in relationship to those three ideas, although it's never articulated very clearly, and to dismantle whatever old oppressive power structures remain to create a landscape that is fairer to everyone. Hence the idea here of grammar as a social construct. In that sense, because grammar and structure often function in some hierarchical capacity where decisions can be made that are characterized as being either correct or incorrect, it must, as a consequence, be stricken from the record or, at the very least, not beholden to in any capacity. This presents a host of problems, though, because more often than not, morally righteous behavior is then tied directly to these composition activities, creating a very hypocritical situation that manifests itself as being simply a matter of right versus wrong, when that particular assertion could not be any further from the very complex reality of what writing actually is and how we create meaning through the way we choose to use and organize words within the construct of the so-called rules of grammar. The issue that arises out of this is that all writing, in effect, deals in some form of power, in some form of manipulation. And I do mean all writing. At its very core, the manipulation of words and sentences, or more appropriately, the manipulation of thoughts and ideas via the vessel of words and sentences and phrases and clauses and fragments and collages, they're all engaging in some form of power over their intended audiences, over their intended readers, whether it's to scare, to anger, to amuse, to elate, to decry, to provoke, to denounce, to uphold, to champion, to condone, or to approve. All composition engages in some form of audience manipulation and power over the audience because that is the whole crux of human communication. We consistently share ideas and opinions and facts and data, both qualitative and quantitative, in an attempt to sway and persuade in the pursuit of efficiency or impact. Or on an even larger level, truth. We engage in fiction and nonfiction narratives to promote semblances of personal truth that we hope affect and impact others on a broader level. But it is fundamentally impossible to push narratives that are considered truly universal or are considered to be representative of underrepresented voices because it implies a level of groupthink and identitarian nonsense that does not value perspectives based on ideas, but perspectives based on immutable characteristics that can conveniently qualify someone's work as being more important than someone else's based purely on race, gender, or sexual orientation. This is where composition studies seems to have already arrived in several ways, and it's a bit of a mess. It's noble, to be sure. Perhaps it even comes from a place of compassion. But I don't think a lot of scholars realize that what they're actually doing is just replacing one form of power with another and using the guise of moral righteousness to justify their attempts to do so. Now, that doesn't mean that certain narratives aren't crafted every single day that really work on a level that impacts a broad variety of people from a broad variety of backgrounds and cultures. That happens all the time. It's the very reason we believe something to be quote unquote universal in the first place, because of its far reaching impact. But the issue of English grammar and the way it fits into the overall narrative about composition studies is supremely complicated. And discussion revolving around its merits in teaching writing and composition, and I believe there is a great deal of merit in teaching English grammar in the context of how we can write more effectively, and it can even serve as the foundation for teaching effective writing, but it requires a level of understanding that at least begins with what I would consider to be fundamental in composition studies. All writing is grounded in manipulation and power. In fact, I might go so far as to say that all communication is grounded in manipulation and power. So instead of being concerned with what should be being written about and what words are acceptable to be wielded in the pursuit of achieving a very narrow list of outcomes, it's far more important to teach students how they can write and how they can wield words to achieve a certain objective. And English grammar becomes the primary method for being able to do this consistently and with intention and a great deal of purpose. Back in 1991, Martha Cohn published a groundbreaking book called Rhetorical Grammar, which delved more deeply than any scholar ever had before into not only the benefits of helping students understand the way structure impacted the ideas they were trying to express, but also provided concrete lessons and examples for educators to use in teaching their students how to take ownership over the structural choices they were making so that they could make creative adjustments that supported the content of their writing. What Cohn did was solidify the necessity of teaching descriptive grammar, helping students understand that every choice you make as a writer is a grammatical choice first, whether you realize it or not, which can then yield very specific effects. Five years later, Constance Weaver published her well-known book, Teaching Grammar in Context, which develops Cohn's ideas even further by actively promoting the pieces that comprise English grammar as constructivist tools for creation, as opposed to prescriptivist methods for merely correcting and revising on the back end of the writing process. This was an incredibly important distinction to make because it paved the way for what many scholars, myself included, now champion as descriptivist or constructivist theories related to the elements of English grammar as valuable tools for creation. Correctness, at least in the formal sense, only becomes applicable as it relates to specific composition objectives. Does the inclusion of an Oxford comma affect the meaning of a particular sentence? Will the use of an em dash instead of a conjunctive adverb carry the intended meaning forward? Will shorter sentences help to better solidify the point I'm trying to make in this paragraph? Am I asking too many questions? With all of this in mind, Dr. Deborah Myhill and her colleagues out of the University of Exeter in England embarked on a year-long large-scale research study, nearly 1,000 students at more than 40 schools, to collect data on student writing using grammar and context that might just give some indication as to whether or not the practical application of Cohn's and Weaver's theories were viable. As it turns out, they are, and significantly so. What Myhill and her team found was that student writing improved across the board from a structural standpoint. More sentence variety and more deliberate and purposeful use of image-driven structures like participles, absolutes, and appositives. Perhaps more enlightening was the qualitative evidence collected via interviews with students and teachers prior to the study and after. Myhill and her team write that, quote, the qualitative data provide further evidence of the impact of teacher knowledge on how the intervention was implemented and on students' metalinguistic learning. It also reveals that teachers found the explicitness, the use of discussion, and the emphasis on playful experimentation to be the most salient features of the intervention, end quote. Dismissing grammar in writing is like dismissing notes and octaves and keys and tempos in music. Grammar in context when teaching writing has very little to do with correctness and right or wrong, and quite a lot to do with understanding how choices in structure impact the overall written experience. Removing the prescriptive nature of how grammar is taught does not mean that grammar disappears, nor that it can't be the most useful tool for helping students learn how to be purposeful and deliberate in making choices in writing that will have the most impact on their readers. This sort of headline is fairly commonplace now, I think, because this particular writer hasn't really thought through how grammar actually works in English or what it's really for. Every language that exists in the world has a grammar, a set of rules, some form of structure and organization that allows its speakers and writers to communicate in ways that maximize efficacy and clarity. Most of the time, breakdowns in communication happen because of something structural. A word is out of place, or a word was used that wasn't exactly incorrect but didn't provide the right connotative resonance that was desired, or the ideas weren't connected together in a way that allowed for the level of clarity needed to make the words impactful. Some structural forms are more intensive than others. English happens to be one that is particularly intense because it is almost entirely an analytic language, where elements, specifically things like prepositions and conjunctions, are often needed in very specific places to achieve the desired level of clarity. Now, that's not always the case, and that's because at the end of the day, a writer's audiences, intentions, and objectives, along with their voice and style, are what must be taken into consideration when determining how effectively specific ideas are communicated. Writing is something of a superpower, and right now composition studies is only concerned with what that power should be used for, and not how writers can wield their words most effectively.